Welcome back, everybody, to another lecture here in History 1302. And today the topic that we'll be covering is both the Nixon administration as well as the 1970s at large, and see how American society was beginning to take shape after that very divisive decade that we had seen within the 1960s, especially as we start to see the rise of conservatism in America by the 1970s. Now for this, I'm going to mainly focus on the Nixon administration for the first half of this video, and then we'll talk about how there's going to be kind of a reaction to what was developing in the Nixon administration during the second half of the 70s. Now the Nixon administration, as we talked about just briefly last time, in 1968, Richard Nixon would run again once again for the presidency that year. However, this time appealing to a group known as the silent majority, as he called them, basically working class Americans who he believed had been marginalized by the very divisive politics of the 1960s, appealing to that group, calling for law and order and eventually to bring about an end to the Vietnam War. Nixon would be elected to office in 1968, taking over as president in January of the following year. And we'll see that he would look to promote at first, or what he would tell Americans, is a more conservative presidency, begin to break down the Great Society programs, restore law and order, and so on and so forth. Now, as we discuss Nixon's administration, we'll see that while he does campaign on a conservative platform, while he does promote some conservative policies, we'll see in other regards he would actually promote progressive policies and actually expand things that we had seen associated with the Great Society and other previous progressive agendas. Now first, as we talk about the Nixon administration, I want to focus on his domestic policies, mainly because that is not what he's going to be relatively well known for. Now during the course of the Nixon administration, what we're going to see is that he's going to adopt a number of domestic policies that would actually look like something that Johnson before him might have extended as a part of his Great Society programs. The first of the domestic policies that we'll see introduced by the Nixon administration would be affirmative action. Now, during the election in 1968, Nixon, in regards to civil rights and race, he was very cool on the idea. He actively appealed to Southerners, adopting a Southern strategy to try to get Southern conservatives to join the Republican Party, which eventually helped lead him to gain the presidential office. However, when he takes office, we'll actually see that he would start to favor a little bit of issues in regards to civil rights. Now, for affirmative action, we'll see that there'll be a number of programs that he would pass, basically trying to end discrimination based on race within applications as well as other employment ventures. And we'll see that he would adopt a number of affirmative action programs during his administration. However, that won't be the only domestic policies to where we'll see he would actually lean more to the left side of the aisle instead of the right side. We'll see this also with his environmental actions during the course of his administration. During the Nixon administration, which had campaigned on a conservative platform, we'll see that he would be able to push for things like the Clean Air Act, I don't think it's called the Clean Water Act, but a Clean Water Act, as well as an Endangered Species Act, beginning to try to clean up the environment, target pollution, and also protect endangered species. And that's something that we often associate with the Democratic Party today, with the Progressive Party. On top of that, what we'll also see is during the Nixon administration, there would be a number of policies and programs established that would help promote women's rights. During the 1970s, we'll see that there would be the creation of a proposed Equal Rights Amendment, or Equal Rights Amendment that would grant women based on gender equal rights. However, that would be shot down. We'd also see that in regards to women's rights, the feminist movement would score a major victory in the court case of Roe v. Wade, which would guarantee that women at this point could have an abortion within the first trimester. Obviously, in recent years, we see that this is still a very divisive issue up to this day, and it had been recently overturned, but we'll see that that case originated during the Nixon administration. And lastly, in regards to women's rights, we'll also see during his administration the adaptation of Title IX, which would basically end discrimination based on gender within schools and so forth. But anyways, with those domestic policies in place, though, while Nixon will fall very much in line with what we'd seen in the Johnson administration, he wasn't very interested in promoting domestic issues. What Nixon was more concerned with was promoting foreign issues, as he believed that was the most important arena, especially as we continue to see the ongoing Cold War entering the Nixon administration. And so let's go ahead and take a look at how Nixon is going to drastically change not only Cold War politics, but foreign policy for years to come. When Nixon takes over the presidency in January of 1969, while he'll make a number of major programs that will impact domestic policy, he's going to be more well known for the foreign policy that he would put forth during his administration. For Nixon, foreign policy was the key facet of his administration, and he wants to be remembered for greatly changing the Cold War. Now, in regards to Richard Nixon, we've already seen him before. He had head the House Committee of Un-American Activities during the 1950s, and he was a staunch anti-communist. However, by the time we get to the 1970s, he's going to promote a program that will begin to promote cooperation with the communists to try to create a situation to where the communist powers of China as well as the Soviet Union could coexist with the United States. And this policy that he would adopt would be that of détente. Now, the détente policy, what he's essentially trying to do is basically cozy up to both the Soviets as well as the Chinese communist governments. The reason for this is because at this point we start to see a rift between those two communist powers. And they weren't really allies at this point. They saw each other more as enemies. And Nixon, to try to improve America's standing, is going to try to cozy up to both of those powers. So that way they see that their proposed new enemy, whether it be the Soviet Union to China or China to the Soviet Union, was now perhaps gaining an alliance with the United States. What this would do is strengthen America's position abroad while also weakening the communist powers. And also as a secondary goal, as the part of this détente policy, if he was able to open up a more peaceful atmosphere of cooperation with both the Soviet Union as well as China, this could hopefully bring about a quicker end to the Vietnam War, where he has already adopted the policy of Vietnamization, gradual withdrawal, and hopefully by establishing a better relationship with the Soviets and the Chinese, they would stop funding the North Vietnamese government. Well, in the spring and summer of 1972, in a presidential election year of all years, Nixon would begin to implement his détente policies. First, he'd become the first U.S. president to visit China since the 1940s, and then furthermore, we'd also see that Nixon would visit the Soviet Union, the first Cold War-era president to actually do so. And he begins to improve both his relationships with both the Soviet Union as well as China, diminishing their power abroad while strengthening the United States' image abroad. On top of that, when he was negotiating with the Soviets, we'll also see that he would establish the SALT talks, to where both sides begin to not denuclearize, but begin to break down the number of anti-ballistic missiles that they have in their arsenals. And with this, we do start to see that there was an improved relationship between the U.S. and the Soviet Union, not just during the Nixon years, but throughout the 1970s. We'll see that the Ford and later, especially the Carter administration, would continue those talks. But when the Soviet Union invades Afghanistan in 1979, we'll see that the Cold War would be renewed during the 1980s. So we'll talk more about that with the Reagan administration. And the détente policy, as a part of that secondary goal, it will help bring about peace negotiations, as we had seen when we talked about the Vietnam War. And by 1973, America effectively would pull out of that conflict. Now, his policies were viewed as a wild success at this point. And it's to no surprise when Nixon runs for re-election in 1972, he's going to win in a landslide victory. Leading up to that campaign, he's going to tell his advisors that he wants to not only win this campaign, but he wants to win big. And that's exactly what's going to happen. However, in that major election, where he had won a landslide victory, even bigger than Johnson's in 1964, there would be the seeds for Nixon's undoing. Because in the summer of 1972, during the midst of the election, this is where we're going to see a break-in take place at the Watergate facility. And through that lone break-in, we'll see that it would begin to unravel the Nixon administration and eventually lead to his resignation. Now, to understand the origins of the Watergate scandal, we have to go back to 1971, prior to the election. Now, prior to the election, what we see in 1971, which I didn't talk about in the Vietnam War video, but really quickly I wanted to address, is in regards to the conduct of the Vietnam War. In that year, the New York Times is going to publish what's known as the Pentagon Papers, which basically details how the federal government had been lying about the origins to the Vietnam War, how it got involved in the conflict, and because of this, a lot of Americans are going to be outraged. Now, what led to the release of the Pentagon Papers was a leak within the federal government. And after this is where Nixon is going to establish a group known as the Plumbers to fix potential leaks before major stories would leak from the federal government. Well, with this group that was established, it would eventually lead to his downfall, especially as we see the Watergate scandal begin to break out. Now, in the summer of 1972, we'd see that the committee to re-elect the president, that of what's greatly named CREEP, is going to basically sponsor a break-in of the Watergate facility to possibly bug the Democratic National Committee's headquarters that was stationed there. Now, these burglars would be caught, they would be arrested, and they'd be brought forth on trial. And what unfolds after the point they come on trial is we'll see that a couple of reporters at the Washington Post, both Bob Woodward as well as Carl Bernstein, are going to begin to dive deeper into this case. And they're going to start to realize these burglars were connected to the committee to re-elect the president in 1972, and then they would begin to connect them with other members within Nixon's cabinet. Now, in regards to the Watergate break-in, there is very much we do not know if Nixon personally had been invested or even known about the Watergate break-in as it was happening. However, what happens afterwards, as we see these trials go on, Nixon's going to try to cover his tracks. He's going to begin to basically try to influence the FBI's investigation of what's going on, as well as many try to issue out bribes and so on and so forth. And with this widespread corruption that was becoming more and more prevalent, the American people are going to start to realize that there was a lot of corruption with the Nixon administration. And eventually, after over 2 years of subpoenas as well as trials ongoing, Nixon, because of this scandal, will be facing impeachment. But before he can face impeachment and perhaps become the first president to be removed from office, he will resign on August 9th, 1974, becoming the first and only president to resign from office. Now, with the downfall of his administration, we will see taking over for him would be that of Gerald Ford. And one thing I do want to note about Gerald Ford, he will become America's first and only unelected president. What do I mean by that? Well, when Nixon ran in 1972, his vice president, Spiro Agnew, was actually had resigned earlier in this administration for his own scandal. And as a part of a new amendment that had been passed, Gerald Ford had been appointed to be the vice president. So when he takes over, he had never been elected to that position. Well, as you could probably guess, when Gerald Ford takes over the presidential office, he will begin to look to 1976 to hopefully gain the White House in his own right. However, the Ford administration will become wildly unpopular. First, Ford would pardon Nixon within the first month of his administration, wildly unpopular amongst Americans at this point. And also, Ford is going to inherit a terrible economic situation that we see in the United States that would also lead to his undoing. And so now, let's shift our focus from Nixon's administration to the American economy and how it's going to be coming crashing down by the middle of the 1970s. Now, by the middle of the 1970s, even before Nixon resigns from office, what we're going to see is the U.S. economy, after experiencing over 2 decades of economic growth, is going to begin to decline. Mainly because we'll see the nation is going to be impacted by a new phenomenon known as stagflation, to where we'd see stagnant economic growth, to where there's not going to be a whole lot of jobs that would begin to open. And we'll also see characterized within this phenomenon, there would be high unemployment as well as high inflation. This is an economic phenomenon that has not occurred up to history by this point. And we'll see that the U.S. economy would continue to go slowly down as we get deeper into the 1970s. What's going to contribute to why we'll see high inflation will be because of the rise in oil prices after the 1973 embargo by OPEC over in the Middle East. And also what's going to contribute to high unemployment and why we'll see stagnant economic growth is America by the 1970s was undergoing deindustrialization. Now, following World War II, the U.S. economy was able to grow because they were really the only major industrial power left after the destructive conflict. However, a part of some of the consequences associated with plans like we had talked about the Marshall Plan, which helped reconstruct, say, Germany as well as Western Europe, is we do start to see that their industries begin to recover from the war. And as those industries recover, they would offer products at cheaper prices, and as a result of this, we'll start to see that American jobs would be lost and industry would be shifted overseas. Companies would also begin to move jobs overseas, and we also see the fall of the automobile industry within the United States. With this process of deindustrialization, seeking out cheaper labor, we'll see many of these jobs will actually be transferred to the Deep South, into what's known as the Sun Belt. And we'll see, because of the fact that deindustrialization was taking place, that's why you see places like Detroit would become largely abandoned as a result of this process. And with all this in mind, during the 1970s, the U.S. economy was effectively impacting average Americans. And it's going to influence them when they go out to the ballot box in 1976 and later on in 1980. But as this phenomenon was taking place, we'll see that the Ford administration would be the first true administration that would have to bear the brunt of what was happening with stagflation. In his response to stagflation, he would open up a campaign known as Whip Inflation Now or When, basically a button-selling campaign that he's going to promote across the United States. Well, as you could probably guess, if you're trying to convince Americans not to spend to lower inflation, that's not going to exactly convince anybody. And therefore, because of this, when we get to the election of 1976, with a stagnant economy, and then also with the fact that he had pardoned Richard Nixon, Gerald Ford is not going to be reelected. In 1976, we'll see a new president would be elected, somebody people viewed as a political outsider, the unknown politician of Jimmy Carter, a former governor of Georgia. He would take over the presidency. However, inheriting this economic situation, we'll actually see, as my light goes out, which, just hold on everybody, as we'll see, even though when he inherits a situation, the economy isn't going to greatly recover until after his administration, leading to why he would be voted out of office in 1980. But for just a moment, as we continue to see stagflation infect the Carter administration, let's also take a look at how Carter is going to continue some legacies that we had seen associated with the Nixon administration, especially in regards to foreign policy. Now, really quick, one thing I did want to mention about the Carter administration. In regards to the puttering U.S. economy, there will be some interest by Carter to begin to invest not in oil energy, but in nuclear energy. However, we'll see that movement to promote nuclear energy would come crashing down with a 3 Mile episode that we see occur in Pennsylvania. Basically, when we see a bunch of radiation burst out of that facility. And we'll see that the nuclear energy movement would come to a grinding halt. But focusing now on Carter's foreign policies, he's really going to continue some aspects that we'd seen in the Nixon administration. We'll see that there would continue to be this policy of détente to cooperate with the Soviets. We'll see this with SALT II talks that take place during Carter's administration. But by 1979, we'll see that détente policy is going to basically, I don't want to say be destroyed, but it's going to evaporate with the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. In the meantime, though, Carter is also going to take interest in other issues on the foreign stage, most notably in regards to human rights. Now, up to this point, the United States, as we had seen, had supported a lot of regimes that they saw as anti-communist. However, many of these regimes proved to be extremely unpopular, and also they weren't very much supported by their local populations. On top of that, we even see that a number of these regimes that they had supported committed a number of atrocities and human rights violations. Well, during the Carter administration, he begins to defund some of these regimes that were committing some of these atrocities, but not all, and that's the key point I do want to point out. In the meantime, though, as Carter was beginning to focus on human rights, we'll also see that he was looking to promote some policies to promote peace, especially within the Middle East. And we see this most notably when he was able to champion the Camp David Accords, to where he would bring about peace between Egypt and Israel, inviting representatives from both of those governments to the famed Camp David, where the president resides. On top of that, we'd also see, though, while he was able to score these major victories, we will see there will be one single event on the foreign stage that's going to lead to the downfall of his administration, and it will be that of the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979. Now, around that time, we see the Iranian Revolution take place, to where the people of Iran are going to overthrow the Iranian Shah, a regime that had been supported by the United States and which was not popular amongst the Iranian people. And after the Shah had been overthrown, when he develops cancer, he would reach out to the Carter administration to seek safe haven in the United States as well as medical treatment. Carter would grant him this permission, and as a result, a number of college-age students in Iran are going to storm the U.S. Embassy there, and they're going to take a number of hostages. I'm blanking on the number right now. I believe it was 56, but do correct me if I'm wrong on that. But anyways, over the course of the rest of his administration, Carter is going to actively try to negotiate to get these hostages released. However, it won't be until the day after he leaves office that we'll see the Iranian hostages, or I should say the American hostages over in Iran are finally released. However, contrary to belief, it won't be because of Ronald Reagan's efforts, but rather it would be because of Carter's negotiations and the fact that the Iranian government wanted to basically humiliate Carter as he's leaving office. But nonetheless, that would be the last major action in the Carter administration, and because of the Iranian hostage crisis, as well as a continuing economy that was puttering, we will see that in 1980, America is going to appeal to conservatism. And that's where we'll see Ronald Reagan elected to office. And in our next lecture, we'll talk more about the Reagan administration and how it's going to create this new phenomenon, Reagan economics, and how it's also going to continue to approach the Cold War. But anyways, that's a topic for the next time we meet and lecture. We'll go ahead and end lecture on that note. Just like always, make sure that you complete all outstanding assignments, readings in the textbook, as well as videos for this week. If you do have any questions in the meantime, feel free to reach out. But otherwise, everybody go out, be safe, and I'll see you on the next video.